you young people, making the most of life while it lasts.
Thank you.
What makes a film a classic? Is it being a critical darling, a piece of art that stands above its contemporaries? Is it being a box office blockbuster, a popularity that makes it a cultural ubiquity? Sometimes. But can films that are mocked on release or slip by largely unnoticed also achieve classic status? Do perceptions change over time as new audiences discover old films, old characters, old performers? Also, sometimes. Yesterday's hottest news may be today's chip paper, but it's also true that something tossed away into the sea with the garbage can be found floating downstream somewhere else, and be appreciated in different ways by new audiences. Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein has often been described as some can't-miss mashup, the box office dynamite of the scariest ghouls of all time, Dracula, the Wolfman, and of course Frankenstein's monster, combined with the hottest comedians of the day, the proven double acts of Bud Abbott and Lou Costello, being a total no-brainer for Universal Studios, the home of both. And that's not really true, not in 1948 when the film was released. Universal's Dracula and Frankenstein both came out in 1931, with America in the grip of the Great Depression, not just commercially successful despite the country's economic difficulties, but rightly acclaimed, superlative and iconic gothic horror movies that frightened on their own terms, as well as setting the visual template for these monsters. Particularly Frankenstein, who did not look like that, not even a little bit, in either contemporary illustrations nor the 1910 short produced by Thomas Edison's Edison Studios. Frankenstein in particular was a box office behemoth, making a star not just of its central monster but of Boris Karloff, an actor over 80 roles deep into a career largely made up of smaller bit parts. His monster surprisingly nuanced and vulnerable beneath the caked-on makeup. While both certainly offered a desperately needed escapism, they also tapped into contemporary fears, Dracula long a metaphor for elites feeding off a suffering working class, and Frankenstein almost the opposite, the monster as much victim as villain, the result of scientific hubris from its creator, a mad genius playing God who sits above the world in his gothic castle, Karloff's sublime performance crafting not just a creature to be feared, but an innocent to be pitied. Seizing on their surprise popularity, Universal began pumping out sequels, including the creative highlight of 1935's The Bride of Frankenstein, as well as introducing new monsters to their gallery of freaks and ghouls, the Invisible Man and the less fondly remembered Mummy. And although still doing solid business for the troubled studio, their horror output was hampered by the introduction of the Hays Code in 1934, restrictions on what was considered acceptable in film which served to defang many a monster, as well as a lack of trust in the genre from the studio, as the Laemmle family were ousted in 1936, and new owners Standard Capital began a spell of belt-tightening that initially led to the disappearance of the trademark monsters from Universal's production slate, and a steady decline in quality when they returned in 1939. While there are exceptions, 1941's Wonderful the Wolfman is one of the studio's very best efforts. The Universal Monster series was enjoying diminishing returns through the 40s. Not just for the reasons I've already mentioned, nor that the output was largely derivative sequels, although they were certainly all factors, but changing sensibilities among audiences as the Great Depression ended and World War II was endured, a cultural zeitgeist that demanded more light-hearted entertainment. No longer were these films prestige Gothic cinema, where once their very best efforts provoked as much thought as fright. They became campy by comparison, relying more on gimmicks to get bums in seats. Like 1943's Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. I think you can guess what happened in that one. To 1944's House of Frankenstein, where Frankenstein met the Wolfman and Dracula. And 1945's House of Dracula, where Dracula met the Wolfman and Frankenstein. Although we see them as fantastically goofy fun now, which they are, these films were largely derided by critics at the time, seen as signs of a studio trying to wring the last ounces of profit out of these tired properties with desperate stunts. Which they were. No longer the earnest horror of Whale or Browning, but increasingly schlocky and lurid, sold on the strength of names on the posters, both characters and actors, and often relegated to B-movie status below more august features, cheapening the stature of all by association. By the time Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein came out, the Universal Monsters had actually been dormant for over 2 years. The last effort from the studio in that broad universe being 1946's She-Wolf of London, which is actually perfectly fine, a fun, if rather tame, little whodunit, undeserving of the derision it receives, although not really a monster movie at all for some inexplicable reason. It's easy to forget in the modern day where the past becomes something of a blob of nostalgia and perception. Of course, these are classics. We all think that now, and presumably they were always thought of as such too. But the Universal monsters were not prestige cinema or even box office bankers at all in 1948. Abbott and Costello too, while they could be argued to be the biggest Hollywood stars of 1941 through 43, although that should perhaps be balanced against their three biggest hits of that period, being movies that parachuted the duo into the armed forces, Buck Privates in the Navy and Keep 'em Flying, light-hearted fare that celebrated servicemen, of the kind that would undoubtedly prove popular during wartime, but who found themselves in something of a career decline as 1948 span around. The duo were famed for their tongue-twisting patter, exemplified by their renowned Who's on First routine.
When you pay off the first baseman every month, who gets the money?
Every dollar of it. Why not? The man's entitled to it.
Who is?
Yes.
Not the pronoun, but rather a player with the unlikely name of who is on first.
Which they may be most closely associated with, but which was built upon a long legacy of similar routines that had passed down from performer to performer in vaudeville and burlesque shows. An environment where ownership of material was slippery, and it was common for comedians to take old setups or conventions and deliver them to audiences with their own spins. Bud and Lou chiefly working throughout their career with writer and former burlesque producer John Grant, who took these well-worn templates and molded them into routines that matched the duo's voices.
What's the fella's name on third base?
But what's on second?
Who's on second?
Who's on first?
I don't know.
He's on third.
There I go. Back.
Oh, no.
First finding fame on radio with these tightly honed, scalpel-sharp slices of wordplay and misunderstanding. Lou's befuddled working-class everyman either falling foul of or triumphing against the odds over Bud's smarter authority figure. Their swift transition to cinema also provided a platform for Lou's broad physical comedy, playing to the gods' double takes, pratfalls, and general tomfoolery that had its roots in their burlesque origins. But I think it's fair to say that audiences were beginning to turn away from both by 1948. Not a disastrous downturn in fortunes as with their studio stablemate monsters, but a string of lukewarm films meeting lukewarm receptions, leading to lower paydays for the pair and lower budgets for their productions, reflecting that their antics had begun to polarize audiences. And where they had once stood shoulder to shoulder as a box office busting double act with Hope and Crosby and their Road 2 movies, they were now firmly in their rival's shadow, the release of Road to Utopia in 1946 and 1947's Road to Rio eclipsing any Bud and Lou efforts of the period. Attempts to switch up the formula partly to revive their fortunes and partly down to a waxing and waning animosity between the pair also stuttered. 1946's Little Giants in the same year as the time of their lives seeing the duo not as a double act, but in separate roles in more standard narrative pictures, and in the latter barely interacting at all. These, however, were poorly received, and while the duo were still working steadily, their careers stood at a crossroads. It seems crazy to say now, given how iconic these monsters remain to this day, and that Abbott and Costello were apparently still pop culture figures worthy of reference in 2025.
We now return to Abbott and Costello Elementary.
We have Mr. Present, Mr. Absent, Mr. Here, Mr. Yep, and Ms. Yo.
Okay, and all of them are here?
Well, no, only one of them is here.
Stealing a living. But the point being, this wasn't a sure thing. Some sources claim that this was a big-budget production, but it was actually around the norm for an Abbott and Costello picture of the time, roughly on a par with the budget for the previous year's The Wistful Widow of Wagon Gap, and significantly lower than the budgets of their biggest pictures, Buck Privates Come Home, Mexican Hayride, and Lost in a Harem. And although it dwarfed the budgets that the most recent Universal monster movies had been allotted, with the notable exception of an attempt to recapture the prestige of the series, with 1943's lavish Technicolor Phantom of the Opera, this reflected that the Universal monsters had for some time been seen primarily by the studio as B-movie filler, and by 1948 weren't regarded as anything of value at all. This was a roll of the dice by a desperate studio, bashing together two dwindling intellectual properties in the hope they would at least make a spark. And a spark they indeed made, and to lazily extend that metaphor, it spread into an inferno, the film Bud and Lou are best remembered for today, and quite rightly, as well as a commercial success for the Universal monster franchise that dwarfed all but the runaway ghost train of 1931's Frankenstein. Not an absolute blockbuster in a year dominated by John Wayne, Fred Astaire, and Bob Hope, but outperforming Alfred Hitchcock's Rope and nearly matching John Huston's classic Treasure of the Sierra Madre starring Humphrey Bogart. So let's take a look at how two comedians met the Universal monsters. The highs, the lows, the good, the Bud, and the Lou.
In a half an hour, the moon will rise, and I'll turn into a wolf.
You and 20 million other guys.
Straight off the bat, eh? We open with an animated title sequence that introduces us to our comedic leads in the cavalcade of monsters, illustrating not only that these creatures of the night had long since ceased being viewed as genuinely scary, but also that they were beginning to be marketed more towards younger audiences, softened and declawed, as with Dick Briefer's incredibly successful mid-40s makeover of the Frankenstein character in comic books, now the Merry Monster, having madcap adventures with other equally softened ghoulies. Abbott and Costello too, while always kid-friendly, were also increasingly leaning into that perception, their films becoming less burlesque review-inspired, but targeting younger audiences, who may have known Bud and Lou better from lookalikes used by Warner Brothers in their cartoons in the preceding years, Abbott and Costello.
You mean a poor little incy-wincy, itsy-bitsy defenseless boy? Yes. Let me at him!
This isn't a film that's going to scare a grown adult out of their mind, and it was never intended to, using its light and cozy chills as platforms for burlesque clowning. These monsters cast as high-stakes antagonists for pantomime he's behind you bits. But while that's certainly the case, are the Universal monsters treated disrespectfully here? Well, Bela Lugosi didn't think so, according to an oft-circulated quote that originated in an interview with the New York Times. "There is no burlesque for me. All I have to do is frighten the boys, a perfectly appropriate activity." I think that's an important aspect of why this film works. This is a Universal monster movie in every aspect of its being, save for its leads being two comedy stars parachuted in to deliver shtick. Take Bud and Lou out of this film and it's broadly indistinguishable from the cheesier Universal monster flicks of the 40s. The busy plot riffs on the monster mashup movies, Dracula assuming the role of mad scientist, who wants Costello's brain so he can transplant it into the flat skull of Frankenstein's monster, seemingly for profit. I don't know and don't care, as Lon Chaney Jr.'s Wolfman seeks to destroy them both, 'cause why not? And that's broadly what you want from this type of movie. Coffins and bats, full moons and werewolves, a creepy castle and secret passages, gurneys and phony scientific equipment that can't possibly have any purpose other than looking cool. Unlike Lou, who made the knowing look at the camera bit a key component of his comedic toolkit, years before Jim Halpert. None of the ghouls are winking at the camera either. In fact, if you told me that Lon Chaney Jr. was trying to win an Oscar here, I'd believe you. His troubled lycanthrope Lawrence Talbot spinning from doe-eyed vulnerability to rage on a pin, barely different from his turns in more serious outings as the character.
Last night, I went through another of my horrible experiences. Soon the moon will rise.
You were on the level about that wolf business?
Yes. I'm going to surrender.
Maybe Lugosi wiggled his eyebrows a bit more than he would otherwise, but again it's Bela Lugosi, and oddly eccentric choices were always part of his charm. This is actually the only time other than the 1931 classic where Lugosi plays Stoker's Count, although 1935's Mark of the Vampire is knowingly winking at audience expectations in that regard. And he was Dracula in all but name in both 1943's The Return of the Vampire and the execrable 1952 effort Old Mother Riley Meets the Vampire. I simply don't know why you wouldn't want to see more of Lugosi in this role. He's fantastic here, straddling that line between haunting and ham. And honestly, it's a shame that Universal didn't recognize how iconic he was as the vampiric count when they had the opportunity, and that he was treated somewhat wastefully in general by Hollywood. Some call this film the beginning of the end for him. It was, after all, his last role in a major picture. But in truth, it was more of a last hurrah. Lugosi considered somewhat unreliable in the industry due to addictions that stemmed from chronic injuries, although rumours have long swirled about political reasons for this distrust, being, as he was, a former communist from Hungary and lifelong leftist, leading to him being investigated by Hoover's FBI post-war. And he had mostly been cast in supporting roles that exploited an ever-fading star power by featuring his name prominently on posters for well over a decade. The barren years that followed stemmed simply from the type of films he was primarily cast in falling out of vogue, and he wasn't alone in this. As earnest monster movies dried up, Chaney Jr. repurposed his career into being a largely supporting character actor, his intimidating presence and capacity for vulnerability, seeing him forge a steady career in westerns and noir. And even Boris Karloff, who didn't appear in Meet Frankenstein and allegedly refused to even watch it, but whose fame in the genre greatly eclipsed any other horror actor of the day, saw his prolific career stalled for a time. I'm going to come clean about one thing. I'm doing this video because this was my favourite movie when I was a kid. And yes, I was a weird kid, thanks for asking. This was my gateway into horror cinema, including the Universal horror films which I devoured, and my love of horror remains with me to this day. Now, as a kid, I loved Lou Costello. In my eyes, he was a cartoon brought to life. This chubby, squeaky-voiced buffoon who winked at the camera and somehow always came out on top. But as an adult, which I technically am, I can prove it and I just don't want to, rewatching these films now, there is no doubt that he could be a lot.
If you want me, just holler. Holler, old chick. You understand? Old chick! What do you want? What kept you?
His chittering, hollering, and mugging are something that I would now probably, prefer in small doses. And as I watched 8 or 9 Abbott and Costello films in a row for this video, many of which were genuinely awful, it was kind of sad to discover that my childhood enjoyment of his antics had developed, on occasion, into tolerance. But as a lovely counterpoint to that, there was the discovery that, as an adult, Bud Abbott is simply phenomenal.
Well, put it down, put it down. Do I have to do all the work?
Breezing effortlessly through the slick routines with his more flustered and bemused partner. His timing always impeccable. The dry, smooth patter of a street corner hustler, spinning from anger to conniving charm on a dime that he'd probably try and sell to you for $1.
I'm not kicking.
You had the best looking one.
So what?
Yours had teeth.
Look, Wilbur, yours had teeth, too.
Did you see that tooth?
Yes, I happened to see it, but...
I don't think it can be overstated how great a straight man Bud was, full of pompous, bad-tempered, misplaced dignity begging to be put in its place, feeding setups for inevitable put-downs with exquisite skill, even when his dance partner isn't his tubby sidekick.
Frankly, I don't get it.
And frankly, you never will. What are we doing tonight?
He's going to a masquerade ball, but I'm not doing anything.
In that case, you'll be awfully lonesome.
Well, naturally.
In fact, looking back at these films, I would even say that the duo's success was always tied to the slickness of Abbott's delivery, as much, if not more, than Costello's histrionic hijinks. Maybe the best straight man in history, often functioning as a one-man comedic Narcan injection preventing an overdose of Lou's shtick. I'm not going to say this isn't dated, of course it is. Its cartoonish sight gags in particular riffing on cliches that were well worn enough to be cliches in 1948, and they've been thoroughly appropriated time and time again since to boot. But this is not just an early example, it's a superior one, elevated by the prestige of the genuine Universal monsters and, ultimately, just so much fun. So what came next? Well, for the Universal monsters, pretty much nothing at all. The studio not seeing the success of the film was an opportunity to resurrect their hallmark villains. And while this has become something of a gateway for new viewers, including me, into the world of these classic creatures, it is canonically the deaths of their Frankenstein's monster, Wolfman, and Dracula. For Abbott and Costello, well, Universal decided that grinding the concept into the ground was the way to go, pitting the duo against other stars and characters to wring the last bits of blood from the decomposing corpses of their once popular properties. So I'll briefly look at those, and then talk a little bit more about the Universal monsters and how they recovered their luster, which is exciting. Like and subscribe.
You didn't see me. I wasn't here.
A year later, in 1949, we got Abbott and Costello meet the killer Boris Karloff. Not really a monster movie in any traditional sense, with a title that seems to be a spoiler, but, spoiler, actually isn't. Instead trading on prominently promoting Karloff's name for a relatively small supporting role, as a mesmerist with a phony swami gimmick, which rather exemplifies how these horror greats were being used by the late 40s. Meet the Killer was originally conceived as a Bob Hope vehicle in the vein of the Cat and the Canary or the Ghostbreakers, but repurposed for Bud and Lou when the runaway success of the Paleface led to Hope being far too good for this kind of hokey genre spoof. We find Bud and Lou as a hotel detective and clumsy bellhop who get wrapped up in a murder mystery centered around a tourist-trapped cavern. Karloff just one of a cast of likely suspects who could have offed a grumpy defense attorney, before they all start dropping dead themselves. Brisk and fun with very little fluff, not on the level of Meet Frankenstein, but still one of the better Abbott and Costello films, despite, or maybe because of, featuring very little of the duo's trademark tomfoolery, although Bud is sadly sidelined for far too much of the film. It's very light, but regardless, it effectively spoofs cozy little Code era mysteries where the bodies keep piling up ludicrously.
All right, boys, let's go.
1951's Abbott and Costello Meet the Invisible Man is a significantly weaker outing that sees Bud and Lou as newly graduated private detectives, hired by an on-the-run boxer who charges the duo with proving his innocence on a murder rap, and who also gets given the Invisible Man serum. And that's just the first 5 minutes. Ultimately, this is less a horror and more an ungodly mashup of tame sci-fi with a dash of noir, and for some reason a hefty injection of boxing picture, maybe riffing on the success of Robert Wise's The Setup or Mark Robson's Champion, for which Kirk Douglas snagged an Oscar nomination, padded out with some particularly tired vaudeville shtick. Its lineage may be on display in a Claude Rains headshot in the background of one scene, but it's really only notable for digging out the very cool invisibility special effects that have been groundbreaking a decade earlier and still hold up here.
What seems to be the matter?
There's someone in this house that shouldn't be here, and it's me.
1953's Abbott and Costello meet Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is certainly better, although it never matches the fun of its 1948 forebear. Its real coup is a fairly prominent role for the great Boris Karloff as Dr. Jekyll, or is that Jekyll?
Dr. Jekyll.
Jekyll.
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 Dr. Jekyll's house.
Jekyll.
Dr. Jekyll.
Dr. Jekyll.
Mr. Jekyll.
Mr. Jekyll?
Dr. Jekyll, I feel like a fool.
You're not the only one. Anyway, Karloff is great here, whether playing coyly innocent, disarmingly charming, smugly monstrous, or delivering mad scientist speeches.
I believe that every human being has two sides to his nature, the good and the evil.
I'm going to turn him into a monster when I kill him. The police will think I did it to save my darling ward.
Now that newspaper man, I hate him.
He's clearly having a whale of a time getting his teeth into something resembling his classic roles during what was a down period in his career. Even if the film plays it for yucks, he never does. And it's particularly fun to see him glowering menacingly next to the towering presence of the wonderfully craggy and lantern-jawed John Dearkes, who I will take this opportunity to point out was, before he transitioned to acting, a prominent economist.
We must dispose of them right now.
With a quaintly realised period setting, a grim and grimy London town, all gaslights and fog, it's a return to the format that works so well in Meet Frankenstein. Bud and Lou background comedic relief to the events of the film, foregrounded in the narrative, despite trying their damnedest to escape it. The film actually does a very good job of replicating the genre it's spoofing too. Journeyman director Charles Lamont relishing the opportunity to ape style in a way he didn't always when paired with the bickering duo, being responsible for some of their lamer efforts. It is a problem that, unlike Meet Frankenstein, there really isn't a lot of story here, so much of the film is either chases, shenanigans, or chases with shenanigans, all of which drag on much more than they should, making it feel longer than it actually is. One thing the film does, which seems worthy of discussion, is the inclusion of the women's suffrage movement as a key plot point, which it's tough to know exactly what to make of. On the one hand, these suffrage movements are unquestionably shown to be the good guys, and the sexism they faced is definitely portrayed as a bad thing. But the film simply can't stop itself from undercutting its seeming good intentions.
Someday women will be able to take their rightful place in business, and the sciences, and the professions.
Mm-hmm.
Now, is there anything I haven't told you?
Yes. Are you married?
And recasting these suffragettes as the Rockettes for a big dance number, well, that was certainly a choice. I don't know, this subplot doesn't have to be there. Cinema of the 1950s wasn't especially well known for sympathy towards the suffrage movement, and it's not a feature of Jekyll and Hyde adaptations either, so points for trying, I guess, however cack-handed the attempt.
Lou, what's the matter? In there. Bandages with eyes. The Mummy of Clarice.
In 1955, we delivered Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy, which isn't the weakest of the duo's films. That probably goes to Abbott and Costello Go to Mars, and you'll never guess what happens in that one. That's right, they go to Venus. But it's still right up there. The Mummy was always the poor relation of the Universal monsters, and the films have aged particularly badly, which is doubly true here. Very late Abbott and Costello. The pair noticeably going through the motions, battling ill health and overwork, with Bud looking in particularly rough shape, the duo sleepwalking through worn routines they both seem thoroughly tired of. No longer the guaranteed ticket movers of their primes, they were increasingly considered old hat, a relic of a style of entertainment that audiences have moved on from, eclipsed in particular by Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, who were proving to be box office dynamite with their looser style, greater versatility, and higher energy. Dino's smooth-talking, whiskey-guzzling ladies' man crooner, offering a sharp contrast to Lewis's exaggerated clowning, a double act born of boozy nightclubs rather than family burlesque reviews. A contract dispute with Universal led to Bud and Lou leaving the studio that same year, and the following year's Dance With Me, Henry, which attempted to move away from their traditional dynamic into what I guess was supposed to be gentle comedy drama, was poorly received by both critics and audiences, and the duo split the following year. But as that partnership died, their old sparring partners were finding new life.
It's alive!
The Universal monsters may have found themselves something of a joke when they first met Abbott and Costello in 1948, but by the late 1950s that was changing. In fact, the standing of a lot of those films, particularly the later entries, doesn't come from how well regarded they were contemporarily, but through television in the late 50s and 60s, where they were in heavy rotation in syndication, often in blocks of programming known as shock theatre, introduced by cheesily costumed presenters like Vampira, a uniquely American brand of battiness that I'm kinda sad I never truly experienced, because this looks great.
Cutting an incision right here in the chest, and then pulling the heart out, and... Wait a minute, what's the matter?
Through this burgeoning medium, they found new, largely younger, audiences who embraced what cinema goers of the 40s had dismissed as campy, because the campiness was precisely the appeal, while to television stations they were relatively cheap, incredibly popular programming blocks that padded out schedules, not just domestically but as time went on, globally. These monsters really became iconic during that time period, even more so than when the films were initially released, a craze known as monster madness that stretched into the 1970s, and reignited interest in these classic ghoulies, often in more cozier, amusing ways, reflecting how they were more embraced by younger generations, such as variations on trad sitcoms like The Munsters or The Addams Family, which debuted a week apart from each other in 1964, or even Count Chocula, who began adorning cereal boxes in 1971. You can see the influence elsewhere too, as with the legendary British studio Hammer Film Productions, chiefly known for crime thrillers but beginning to dabble with timely science fiction, like 1955's boundary-pushing The Quatermass Experiment. The studio sharply pivoting with 1957's The Curse of Frankenstein and 1958's Dracula, films made with one evil eye on American markets, that were suddenly voraciously consuming exactly that kind of ghastly fare. The monsters were back, and they were bigger than ever. This led to late career resurgences for Karloff and to a lesser extent Chaney Jr. and John Carradine, their names back on movie posters for more purpose-made cheesy schlock, although it came too late for Lugosi, who sadly passed away before being able to benefit from this craze. Doubly sad as these later more knowing films would likely have suited his oddly mannered style, exploiting it rather than demanding its submission into what were often unsuitable environs. These films were no longer jokes, except in the way that we were all in on it. They were beloved, not derided for being cheesy or outdated by audiences who yearned for something new, but celebrated by new audiences who sought to revel in their schlocky thrills, the centre point of many a late-night movie marathon. And Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein fits right in, both a perfect coda and a perfect entry point for the wonderful universe of the Universal Monsters. Thank you very much for watching. If you've listened to this, you made it all the way to the end, which is awesome. This was a fun little Halloween video. Hopefully you're watching it at Halloween, and if not, it's probably Halloween somewhere, or at least it is in my heart. Feel free to comment below if you have fond memories of Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, or just Bud and Lou or the Universal Monsters in general. I hope you have a suitably ghoulish Halloween, enjoy your candy, and hopefully I'll see you next time.